as some of you may know, medical schools are at the forefront of innovations in holistic admission strategies. If you did know it, it's one of the things that I've discovered in the work that I've done in this area since the 208 conference that kind of started NCID's work in this area. And this conclusion is based on a very detailed review of existing literature. I'm told by my medical school stakeholders that they are somewhat surprised at that assessment because they have such a long way to go. You know, and so again, this assessment that is certainly reflected in the literature doesn't indicate, you know, that the race is finished. You know, but it does mean that the unique, and this is, I think, my appraisal, that the unique arrangement with AAMC, Association of American Medical Colleges, with medical schools, and the degree to which medical doctors, as medical scientists and medical professionals, you know, certainly have to be very sensitive to these issues of performance in complex contexts. And the issue of cultural competence, the issues of being able to kind of address not only bedside, but healthcare in a broad range of complex contexts, have kind of forced the profession into some deep discussions, you know, about what makes a good medical doctor. You know, not only what makes a person perform in medical school, but what makes a good medical doctor, has kind of forced a very deep dialogue, I think, between AAMC and the medical schools themselves. And it's one of the reasons why we decided, as kind of an indication of the exemplary work that's done in this sector, to kind of feature this as a luncheon session. So the Association for American Medical Colleges oversight of medical schools across the country, the comprehensive strategies for assessing medical school candidates' potential for success have been systematically not only institutionalized, but continue to be vetted and continue to be something that I think is a focus of research and development and also experimentation. So it is with great pleasure that we feature Dr. Marc Nivet, Chief Diversity Officer for the Association of American Medical Colleges, as keynote luncheon speaker today. In his role at AAMC, Dr. Nivet provides strategic vision and programmatic leadership around diversity and inclusion. He strives to reframe the narrative around diversity, positioning it as a driver of excellence and highlighting the link between community engagement and health equity. He also seeks to elevate diversity out of its silo into the company of talent management and strategic planning to transform organizations and communities, ultimately enabling health outcomes for all. Dr. Nivet serves the diversity and academic medicine communities on a variety of boards and commissions, such as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's New Careers in Nursing Scholarship Advisory Committee and the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Medical College Roundtable. Following his presentation, we will hear from 3 panelists who will offer commentaries from their own professional leadership roles. 2 from the medical school here at the University of Michigan, and also 1 from the graduate college. Stephen E. Gay is Assistant Dean for Admissions and Assistant Professor of Medicine, the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine. Is that right?
Yes.
At the University of Michigan's Medical School. He also currently serves as Director of Critical Care Support Services and the Director of
bronchoscopic services.
Yes, of services for a medical specialty that I can't pronounce. Dr. Gay's clinical and research interests includes exercise physiology, psychophysiology, and intestinal lung disease, and outcomes in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And then secondly, we have Monica Lypson, who is Interim Associate Dean for Diversity and Assistant Dean for Graduate and Medical Education at the U of M Medical School. Her extensive service on national committees greatly informs her work in monitoring the accreditation status and also the educational quality of the medical school's residency programs. Mrs. Lypson's, or Dr. Lypson's, research interests include resident assessment, historical and contemporary trends in medical education, academic leadership, and the underrepresentation of minorities in academic medicine. Last but not least, and we juxtapose the focus on medical school here with a broader focus on a perspective from the level of the graduate school here, the Rackham School of Graduate Studies, by Marc Kamimura-Jimenez, is Director for Graduate School Success, or Graduate Student Success for the Horace H. Rackham Graduate School, School of Graduate Studies at Michigan. Prior to this role, he was the first Director of Educational Partnerships for California State University in Fullerton, the first position of its kind developed in the Cal State University system. He received his PhD here at the University of Michigan Center for the Study of Higher Post-Secondary Education. So with no further ado, please come and get started, Dr. Nivet.
Let me, because I'm really interested and became more curious in listening to the previous presentations about some fundamental assumptions that are inherent in the room and inherent in all of those presentations. So maybe I'll be a bit provocative. Maybe I will maybe even offend some folks. But know that I'm only doing that to push us so that we are, as individuals who are focused on trying to increase diversity at our nation's medical schools and college campuses across this country, I think we have to become a little bit clearer in our rationale, not just because, as we heard earlier, what's happening in the Supreme Court, this Fisher, Texas case, but really just for our own justifications and rationales, making our institutions move forward, not just in the historic, symbolic, and social justice rationale, which is extremely important for diversity efforts, but what's beyond that? What's the next level case to be made? And I'll just tell you a story that I think firmly undergirds what I think I did not hear this morning. There's a story told by Clay Christensen, who is a business professor, a named professor at Harvard Business School. He tells this wonderful story about when he was a young consultant going out. He was assigned to a hamburger chain that wanted to sell more milkshakes. But before he was brought in as the secondary consultant because the first consultant wasn't successful. The first consultant did what any consultant would do, right? They come in, they look at who's buying milkshakes. That's the target. If you know anything about milkshakes at these hamburger chains, they're sort of a high generator in terms of revenue. So it's important to sell more milkshakes at these institutions, at McDonald's, Burger King, et cetera, et cetera. So the consultant comes in, sits down, looks at who comes into the hamburger chain and is buying milkshakes. They've got demographic data, psychographic data, they do qualitative research, they interview the people, they put it all together, and as consultants do, they show up to the office and hand the manager the big brown book, which tells them what to do based on our observations. This is what the consultant says to do. And they do everything the consultant says. They follow it right through. The consultant told them that these people look like they're busy when they come in. They look like they're, in work clothes. They did notice something was odd, that people were buying milkshakes in the morning, but they really weren't able to sort of tease that out, but they told them that. And so people looked like they were in a rush. So they told them, move the machine closer to the door, give people a swipe card. They look like they're in a hurry. Long story short, they do all of that. 1 year later, milkshake sales have not increased. So they bring in Clay Christensen and his team, and they do the same thing. They sit down, they analyze what's happening, they talk to people. But they ask one question that the previous consultant did not ask. they asked them, what's the job you're hiring the milkshake to do? And just like you're giving me these quizzical looks like, what are you talking about? The people looked at Clay and said, what job am I hiring the milkshake to do? And after a back and forth, he got them to understand, what is your purpose for buying that milkshake? What is the job that you're hiring the milkshake to do? And once people got it, they said, oh, it turns out the vast majority of people, the reason why they're buying milkshakes in the morning is they happen to be people who have a 2-hour or more longer commute to work. Well, if you know anything about a milkshake, it's viscous, right? It takes a long time to get it down. So when they get to work, they don't have time for breakfast. They've got to get to work. Right? These are blue-collar employees. They've got to get to work and get going. They don't have time to stop and eat after this 2-hour drive. But he asked another question. So what do you hire when you don't have a milkshake to get that job done? Because clearly there's a job to get done. It's for me to get to work and not be hungry. Well, they said, I try a banana, but I eat a banana, 10 minutes later I'm hungry. I try a donut, it's messy, it's sloppy, my hands are sticky, it's not comfortable to drive. Right? I tried a Snickers bar, but I don't want to eat a Snickers bar that early in the morning. Right? So it turns out the milkshake is the best thing to get the job done. So the question, taking an analog from that, which I have not heard yet, what's the job we're hiring diversity to do? That's the fundamental question. We spent a lot of time, and that's why I really don't want to spend so much time on holistic review, although I'll go into it. But let me begin by saying holistic review is not new. It's not some innovative, inventive thing that we, the AAMC, came up with in the last 5 years. In fact, 20 years ago, there was a gentleman in my position, his name was Herb Nickens, unfortunately he's passed away, created a program called the Expanded Admissions Exercise. It was holistic review. It was the exact same concept. It was undergirded the same way. We have better words now. We have better slide decks. But 20 years ago, we were doing holistic review. Right? And many of our institutions, not just medical schools, have been doing holistic review. And let me be clear, there is no magic bullet to holistic review. Right? It's not going to solve the world's problems. We have to fundamentally ask ourselves, what's the job we're hiring diversity to do? Once we get that question answered, for your specific campus, whether it's holistic review or some other approach to admissions, is when it will matter. So one of the first things I did when I got to the AAMC 2 years ago, I did two things. One is I said, is holistic review a diversity initiative? And everybody shook their head. And I said, well, then it's not going to work. And they said, what do you mean? And I said, holistic review is either better admissions or it isn't. Derivative of that, you get more diversity, if that's your goal. But it's either a better admissions process or it is not. And people said, that's true. And I said, well, then it's got to get out of my office. It can't be in the diversity office. It has to be in academic affairs, where everything else we do in admissions resides. So situating it in the proper place was important. That's the first thing I did. The second thing I did was there were all these signs. There was a campaign going on at AAMC at the time called Changing the Face of Medicine. And I remember walking around newly on the job, the president's excited and the EVP's excited to show me all the wonderful material that they developed. A couple of $100,000 campaign. I said, wow, we're going to have to rip that up. And they said, why would we rip this up? We just invested several $100,000. I said, because if you change the face of medicine, and we have the same health outcomes in this country, and we still have health disparities, who really cares? If all the faces are brown magically in medical school and we have the same health outcomes, have we really moved the dial? So for us in healthcare, what we're hiring diversity to do is something very simplistic. It's to balance the biases inherent in healthcare. And I could give you tons of studies, stories that can easily explicate the biases that exist in healthcare, at the point of care, at the system level, You can look at health disparities in this from county A to county B, in Michigan, and easily discern that diversity for us is a compelling interest not for educational benefits. That's one component. That's the Michigan case relied on that. But I say something much more important than that, which is improving the health for all. And not just improving the health for all, but actually compressing or eradicating the health disparities that exist. You know, many of our institutions talk about improving the health of the public. But you can actually improve the health of the public and still maintain the disparate care, right? I mean, they just keep moving in lockstep. So what we're really trying to do is to figure out how to harness diversity, not value diversity. I'm trying hard to get people to stop at our medical schools with their signs that say we value diversity. That's meaningless. Every dean, every president of a university can stand up here and give an eloquent speech about the value of diversity. But where's the execution? It's not about valuing diversity. It's about harnessing diversity. It's about harnessing those differences. It's about changing our paradigm and our rationales for why we want diversity. And so to do that, what I've been trying to create is a new framework, a new way for us to think about diversity and inclusion. You know, I think in medicine, and frankly, this as well probably offend you, I think we've been navel-gazing too long in higher education. We simply look inward at what we're doing. And I think it's really important for us to get outside our spheres and our places that we're comfortable and go to other places to see what they're doing around diversity. So I spend a lot of time in the business community. I spend a lot of time in Silicon Valley just trying to figure out what people are doing. And by the way, they're not having any greater success, greater success in thinking about or in the numerical diversity. But there are some interesting things happening because they understand what they're hiring diversity to do, which is to drive profit, to get into, to be a global company, right? It's very clear. And we talk about, civic engagement, civil society, those are wonderful things, but to date, it hasn't moved the dial. It hasn't become an imperative for our institutions. We haven't moved from valuing it to harnessing, to using, to driving. And what would we drive it for? Well, the framework is basically what I think many of our institutions are, many of our medical schools, many of our colleges and universities are still in what I call the 1.0 framework, Diversity 1.0. In Diversity 1.0, you can read the slide, but a quick way to understand what I mean by that, and it's really been like this since 1954, right? Since, Brown versus Board of Education. It's when our mental model for diversity was, we can be excellent, but if we were also going to be diverse, we had to give up something on our excellence quotient. That diversity and excellence competed. And that's the 1.0 framework that many of our institutions, unfortunately, still are. What moved us off many of the better institutions, Michigan included, got us to what I call the 2.0 framework, really because of the Grutter and Gratz decision. Much of the work by Pat Gurin and others across the country really helped us understand that it wasn't that diversity and excellence competes, right? We can be excellent institutions and we can be diverse, right? I mean, that's I'm obviously generalizing, taking all of the literature and trying to put it into a succinct way of thinking about it. But coming out of that case in Michigan, we recognized we could be diverse and excellent. And that's a good thing. And again, many of our leading institutions are in the 2.0 framework. Unfortunately, the 2.0 framework leaves us short. The 2.0 framework, you think about the words we use. We have to go out, recruit, and retain. We've got to go recruit people, and we've got to retain them here, right? Very outward looking. Right? There's a problem out there in the K through 12 system, or there's a problem out there in the undergraduate colleges. So we've got to go out and recruit and retain people, because when they come here, we feel that they're not doing what they should do. But a 3.0 mindset would move from thinking about recruitment and retention, which is there's a problem out there, to thinking about why can't we attract the diversity that we say we want. And does everyone at this institution thrive? Right? So it's moving from recruitment and retention to attraction and thriving as a mental model, as a way for the institution to then behave. So the 3.0 framework is diversity is a driver of excellence. It's not a parallel system to excellence. It's not we're going to be excellent and diverse. In our lexicon in medicine, we talk about having a tripartite mission: discovery, education, and patient care. And those are our function areas, really. And our goal is improving the health for all. And in my language, it's eradicating those health disparities. I would tether to that. But diversity and inclusion become a tool that you can harness to accelerate your pace to achieving the mission. But you do that through those function areas. It's not absent or separate or parallel to thinking about excellence. Diversity is a driver of excellence. Those differences, Scott Page talks about this, wrote a wonderful book about that, Michigan professor was here earlier. So it's really getting us to think clearly before we can even talk about holistic admissions. Before we can talk about, valuing diversity or wanting diversity, what are we hiring diversity to do? Answering that fundamental question at your particular school, not just university, your school. Does that roll up into the University of Michigan's rationale for why they want diversity? Right? And it's not about having separate, we've got a university strategic plan and a diversity strategic plan. That's 2.0. It's separate, it's parallel. The key is diversity a core driver of your current strategic plan? Right? Because many of our institutions are doing these separate strategic plans. So what we've done is to pull out, this is, for the previous presenters know this well, because we've taken all of the wonderful literature, all the things that you've put in the literature, all the things that you've thought about and worked on. We've come up with what we call the EAM model for admissions, which is experiences, attributes, and metrics. Right? And the metrics are, for us, the MCAT score. Right? So students take the medical college admissions test, and and it's just interesting listening to the conversation earlier because, and there was a debate earlier about the sort of the value of these exams. What the real value is that it scales efficiency in a competitive admissions process. That's all it really does. Right? It's a weeding out mechanism. Right? But if you think about what the MCAT is, or the SAT, or the ACT, if you think about what they are, and let me speak specifically to the MCAT for a second. We're asking you to regurgitate information on an exam that we already know the answers to. Right? I can Google every answer and get it in faster than you can get it. Right? But somehow that tells me that is supposed to be a predictor of your success, right, in medical school. But it turns out it is a valid and wonderful predictor of success of at least your first year of medical school, the basic science year, and it has wonderful correlation to part 1 of the boards. Well, why do you think that is? It's pretty simplistic, right? Because what do we ask you to do? We ask you to memorize things in medical school, at least that first year. And the board exam, great correlation. There should be correlation. It's not rocket science. But the question is, we have scaled efficiency to tell us who can graduate our medical school. But that's not what we need. We need measures that help us understand who has the greatest capacity to serve the public. Who has the greatest capacity to be a health care provider? What we are unable to do, and all of what you heard today, this morning, in terms of these wonderful holistic approaches, where they fall short, and where we fall short currently, is that it's not a highly efficient model. And it's supposed to be mission-based, which means what you really need to do is not just scale efficiency, but scale customization. Well, how do you do that when you have 10,000 applications for 100 seats in your medical school? By the way, I think technology is going to solve all of this for us. I think there's going to be some platforms that will be developed and we'll get there. We're just not there yet. But until we shift our mindset and starting to understand that it's not that, finding individuals that graduate medical school and people who can go on and serve should be different things the way they currently are. In a perfect admissions system that is yet to be designed, those two things would blend. They would map to each other. The people that could graduate your medical school obviously would be the best people to go on and serve the public, right? I mean, that's the gold standard. That's what we're looking for. But I mentioned the difference in our institutions in the need for customization. Well, why do you need customization? You need it because medical schools are not all out to do the same thing. They actually have different missions. I'll give you a glaring example. Stanford University, they wouldn't say it this way, but basically is out to create 80 academic docs a year, right? They're looking for people to go on and be leaders and scholars and researchers and sort of repeat what their institutions, bring people in who can sustain and repeat what that institution is doing and putting people out in the world. That is a fantastic mission and we need it. And no one debates whether Stanford's an excellent institution or not. Most people will say Stanford is a fantastic, excellent institution, me included. Morehouse University, Morehouse Medical School, I should say, wants to put out 55 primary care docs every year. Right? Again, I'm generalizing on their mission statements to make the point. But they basically want to take people in who are going to go off into their community, go back to the communities of need and serve those communities. So they're looking for very different things, different experiences, different attributes, and even different MCAT schools, or at least they should be. But why don't we have agreements that Morehouse is just as an excellent medical school as Stanford? Right? They both meet their mission year in and year out. They're both fantastic institutions. And I think I know why. When I first took this job for 6 months, I was running around going, I'm going to reframe diversity, I'm going to reframe diversity. It took me 6 months to figure out it's not reframing diversity, that actually doesn't make sense. But it's reframing excellence. What is excellence? How do you define excellence? What is an excellent institution? Is an excellent medical school one that has, ranks highest on the U.S. News and World Report and gets tons of NIH dollars, but when I look outside the dean's window of that particular medical school, there's health disparities all around in their local community? Right? I mean, so how do we define excellence? Right now, we have this narrow definition of excellence, and in fact, a lot of our conversation this morning, I told you I'm pushing you guys a little bit, and I expect a lot of questions. Even in our discussion today, this morning, we're still talking about a narrow definition of excellence. Right? How do we, and it's because we've got these scaled, efficient ways of thinking about talent. Is it the excellent medical school that can take kids with 35s on the MCAT, right? Good scores on the MCAT, and they all graduate, they all pass the boards, and they go on and be successful? Or is it the excellent medical school that can take them from a larger continuum, from 24 to 35 on the MCAT, graduate them, they go on and they're successful? What does that tell you about the educational, what does that tell you about the curriculum and the educators at that institution? Is it harder to graduate a medical school class full of 24s on the MCAT than it is with 35s on the MCAT? Yes. It's more work. There's no question about that. But here's the thing that surprisingly no one looks at. From 24 to 35 on the MCAT, everybody graduates. It's in our MCAT reports, it's out there. Cut it by race, ethnicity, cut it any way you want, except one particular way. When you map low socioeconomic status onto race and ethnicity, or to African American and Hispanic, you see a slight, about a 2-point differential in terms of graduation rate. I mean, that's not surprising, I would imagine. But if you cut it by race, ethnicity, everybody's graduating our medical schools. And I love it when I go to medical schools because they always tell me, you know, we took this student in and we knew we were taking a risk, this African-American student, and we knew we were taking a risk. And he didn't make it, and we feel so bad we just can't do that again. The wonderful thing about being at AAMC is that we have data. And so I always come to the schools with data, and I go, but you had 5 white kids that didn't graduate also, they failed out. How come you're not telling me about those kids? And the person goes, and it's not out of malice, they actually didn't even realize, because the numbers of folks of color at the institutions are so small, it is a tragedy when the person leaves. Everyone feels it, it's noticeable, it's talked about, all right? But the diversity lens, for me, is a wonderful lens to look in for organizational performance improvement. Everything you heard today, to me, wasn't really a discussion about diversity. It was about we have suboptimal ways of doing effective admissions. We looked at it through a diversity lens. But if we take the diversity lens off for a second and say, well, how would you optimize admissions broadly that actually would have benefit for all? And derivative of that, you'd have more diversity. It's a different approach to it, and plus, as I'm trying to do at my particular institution, is you get buy-in in different ways and from different people that you would not expect. Because now we're talking about we have suboptimal performance. Because we disaggregate data, we can see where we have those spots, those bright spots. So, to me, it is about merit, but it's about defining merit. And again, is merit just scoring the highest? I mean, now let me just give you some data. So the nation's medical schools, 20% of the nation's medical students, 20% come from 15 colleges and universities. Michigan puts a lot of kids, your graduate school puts a lot of kids into medicine. 18% come from 26 high schools across this country. And you can name them in Michigan, those of you who are from Michigan. I can name them in New York. They come from Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech. Those are the high schools that pump the kids out that go into anything rigorous in science or medicine or the health professions, right? So if you think about who we're getting in medicine, they come from this very narrow band, right? And as Scott Page would tell you, if you take people, if you're limiting your vision of success to that very narrow band of individuals, when they get to the complex problems, especially the ones that we face in medicine, by the way, all the easy problems in medicine have been solved. When you get to those tough problems, they all get stuck at the same logical sticking point. They've come from the same high schools, they've come from the same, I forgot to say, 90% of the medical students in this country come from the top 2 decile income earners. Should be, maybe it's not startling because you're all in this space, so you understand that. So the question is, merit right now the way we define it is that big. And we have an inability to really measure things like, we in medicine, currently, perseverance, tenacity, road traveled. But let me be clear, we do all of that. It's just post the bright line of MCAT score. So we do it at the point of interview. How much talent do we lose before we even get to the interview process? Now, nobody here, my colleague Stephen wouldn't admit it, but they know what that bright line is by which people will be successful or it will be harder to do. And whether they use a bright line or not, there's a mental bright line that people know. So anyone who's been doing admissions for 3 to 4 years at a particular institution, it's not rocket science. You get it. You know how to put that class together. But what other tools do you have pre-interview? That's the scaled customization part. Now, I don't know how you would even attempt to do that at undergrad level with 40,000 applications. That's just mind-boggling. But even in medicine, we struggle with that. But that's what we have to get to. If we're serious about this holistic, if we're serious about redefining merit, it has to happen sooner. So the admissions process is just the entry point. It's really about changing the way we think about success at the medical school or for the medical school. Right? So it's really about, if you're asking people to regurgitate information and they're going out into a world where they can get the information on their iPad, a practitioner can get it on their iPhone or whatever faster than they can remember something, right? And they're all going to be there. Are we educating them for the right things? What do we mean by smart? Smart is no longer, the gift of memory, scoring high on the test. It's your ability to take disparate pieces of information, right? Make sense of it and come up with a differential diagnosis, which has always been the point of medicine, by the way. But how do we measure for that? How do we test for that? I know some of my colleagues will tell me that they can do it, but how do we do it in a mass customized way? All right. That's what we're facing. I do think, as I said, technology is going to help us in this space. But I think with the greatest technology, with our inability to think about merit broadly or redefine merit and redefine excellence, we'll just have wonderful programs like holistic admissions. We'll come up with newer, better processes. At the end of the day, we won't meaningfully change what diversity looks like on our campuses. Let me end with just one final scary statistic. So for years we've known, 2050 the country does the majority-minority flip, or now people are saying 2042, the 2010 census data came out, somebody alluded to that earlier. Let me give you a more startling piece of evidence that came out of the 2010 census. The demographers at Brookings did this work to show the under 18-year-old population in this country is just about at parity, majority-minority. Now guess where all the minority students are attending schools? The vast majority of those minorities are attending schools. Poor performing school systems, Atlanta, Detroit, New York City, Washington, D.C. China, by the way, has more students who score the equivalent of a 1600 on the old SAT. This was in The Economist the other day. Then we have kids in the K through 12 pipeline. It becomes really clear in terms of globalization and what we mean by success. If we've got that many talented people, our supply chain, if we don't engage in the supply chain in a meaningful way, I'm not talking about doing a pipeline program for 80 kids of talent. I'm talking about fundamentally using an institution like Michigan to alter the poor performance in our school systems. All of this is just not going to be enough. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
And what I would like to discuss right now is how we as a medical school see those challenges and how we have begun to cope with them, deal with them, and put us in a position where we are doing the things that we wish to do as a medical school. So as all of you have sat here, you have been presented with what the unique or perhaps not so unique challenges are in the state of Michigan. On the one hand, we deal with Proposal 2. And as all of you know, to summarize Proposal 2, it is any public college or university shall not discriminate or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. However, there is a caveat to that clearly states that this section does not prohibit actions that must be taken to establish or maintain eligibility for any public programs if eligibility will result in the loss of federal funds to the state. So there is a clear direction from the state level of how we are supposed to begin to admit and look at students. However, a number of years ago, and although it is now being readdressed in the Supreme Court in the upcoming session, Grutter versus Bollinger clearly stated to us and supported that a diverse student body has its own benefits and that actions still need to be taken to assure this in America. So as we look to walk this road to assure the optimal educational opportunities in our medical school to assure that young physicians who leave our medical school are most adequately prepared to serve our population, serve our society, serve our communities in the way that we feel they should be served, there are certain things we have to do. Now, one of the things that has been spoken of today at a number of different levels is the holistic review, reading, performance of admissions. In order to perform a holistic reading and a holistic evaluation of a student, a number of different things are absolutely essential. First and foremost is actually a clear and focused institutional belief of what the definition of diversity is for your institution. This is important because without these goals, without this seminal belief from the very beginning of the admissions process to the end of the admissions process, with all individuals involved in the process looking at the candidates in the same way and understanding what the core values of an institution are, you will fail in your acquisition of diversity in your institution, because everyone will define it in a different way, and that cannot occur. So when we look at our own definition, which gets right down to the institutional objectives of who we are as a medical school, we look at two very specific categories. Those categories are the essential attributes of the student, which will include things like academic excellence, altruism, integrity, competency, communication skills, and a dedication to medicine. We also, however, look for the unique potential of these students, which will look toward their future potential for working with underserved populations, working in underserved medical specialties, propensity to leadership, unique and significant life experiences, scientific or social research experience, additional degrees, educational background, and their socioeconomic status. Understand, as we perform admissions at the University of Michigan, we have been helped enormously by the AAMC, as these are many of the guidelines that they have given us to perform an appropriate holistic assessment of medical students, of what it would mean for our society to put forth physicians with these characteristics. But understand, in order for our admissions process to work, it has to start at the very beginning, with the reading of those applications in such a way that you are looking to fulfill these attributes. That when each and every interviewer interacts with a potential candidate, they are doing so looking to fulfill these attributes as a definition of what the university, what our society, what our community, what our medical school wants to see in the physicians that they put forth. Without a clear institutional decision and focus toward what diversity will be for your institution, it will be incredibly difficult to achieve. Now, as we have looked toward that level, we have also noticed something very important. As we look at our fellow medical schools across the country and how they interact with their state, it has become very clear that there isn't a lot of collaboration within states with medical schools. We have worked very hard to make that a significant difference here in the state of Michigan. We believe it takes a community, a university, and a state collaborative focus to obtain and fulfill the goals of diversity at our institution. So as we look within at our own university, one of the programs that we use very aggressively is simple communication. We have monthly meetings and monthly interactions with our fellow professional schools here at the University of Michigan and with our undergraduate campus. We speak, Ted and I speak monthly about what our best practices are, what our challenges are, what our focus should be, and we look to combine our efforts, combine our focus across all the disciplines to enhance diversity at the university. It isn't about simply looking to enhance university at the medical school, at the law school, at the business school, but it is to do something that is important for the university and what the university's core beliefs are. We also work very hard to have developed a statewide collaboration. All of the medical school admissions departments in this state sit down together quarterly and do, again, exactly what I have described. We sit and determine our best practices, our challenges, and what we can do together to improve the diversity in our medical schools across the state. Now, as I've said, this is somewhat unique. We do not feel we are in competition with the medical schools in our state, far from it. All of us have sat down and believed that our goal as medical schools in this state is to perform and improve the access to health care in our state and to put forth the best physicians that we can. We can do so better working together than we can separately. Because if we all improve, we all do better at what the state requires and needs. So we openly share these practices. Recently, a few months ago, we had our first statewide pre-medical fair where all of the medical schools for the first year came here to Michigan. And we worked through with 800 to 1,000 potential candidates to go to medical school and enter the health professions, what it means to go through an applications process, who we are as institutions, what our goals are as institutions, and what we look to do for this state. It is essential as we look to do these things to believe that we can reach out as opposed to look inward. Because if we stand alone, we will fail. And so as a consortium of medical schools, we believe we can enhance and improve our approaches to maintaining and improving diversity in our physician population. We also look to work with our pre-med advisors, not only within our state, but outside our state at our peer institutions. It is our belief that if we can maximize the applicants to our medical school, that we will enhance our diversity. So as Monica will speak to very soon, we have a number of pipeline programs and other things that help us to increase the overall potential applicants at a very early level. But we also have to work so that the groups who are beginning to instruct and inform these potential candidates know what we are looking for. So we work very closely with our pre-med advisors, not only here within the state of Michigan, but with our peer institutions who we are finding are successful at improving diversity at their undergraduate level to work to improve it here. How do we do it? It's by showing them who we are and what we want. We work to run a very transparent process to admissions. So those pre-med advisors on a yearly basis come, see the campus, speak to our faculty, but then they also sit and participate in an admissions executive meeting where we are actually making decisions on students. I know at some institutions that is a very cloistered group of individuals. We have found it important to be transparent and open so people can know and understand who we are, what we are looking for, and the criteria that are important for us as we look at students. So when they then go back to counsel their students, they are as well informed as possible about what we look for as the University of Michigan and what we look for to continue to enhance our diversity as an institution. We also work to develop a number of programs through the state. We have worked with all of our pre-med advisors to tell them if you have identified exceptional candidates that you feel would be exceptional at this institution, we will guarantee them an interview to our institution to look at them and evaluate them and hopefully have them matriculate here. We have programs through many of the underserved areas. The Brem Scholars, Dee and Bill Brem, have been extraordinarily generous to allow a group of students from Forson High School a very underserved area just outside of Detroit, but an underserved area that we define as an underserved area as a high population of Arab American students, which are important to our state, to help them matriculate here as undergraduates, and then they have continued their support. If they get into medical school, they will continue to give them full scholarships to pay for their medical school. So working on programs like that, working on programs such as the Hope Scholars with individual institutions as well, helps us to look to improve our candidate pool, broaden our candidate pool, and become more effective at improving diversity at our institution. So as we look at who we are and what we wish to be, it has become very clear to us that it has to be defined. It has to be characterized and classified so that every individual who participates in the process knows and understands the goals, the focus, and the character of our medical school. And that this medical school works as a group with the other medical schools, with our community, with our own other institutions of higher learning, graduate schools here at the University of Michigan, to improve and enhance the diversity for the entire group and not just the medical school as an individual. Thank you.
I have an exercise that might cause some controversy, so I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and do this exercise. So how many of you want a physician who has passed their medical licensing test? Please raise your hand. How many of you want a physician who is board certified? How many of you know the score that your physician received on their licensing exam? How many of you all know the score that your physician, your personal physician, has received on their board certification exam? You can open your eyes. I bring this up because there had been a lot of conversation a little bit about these standardized tests and what the value of the tests are. And when we're thinking about the outcome, thinking about the patient outcome, Mark talked about there's a bright line, but the line is not so bright about sort of passing versus failing and how you're going to proceed through the system. And I'm glad the slide is left up here because I'm actually going to touch on all of these issues and sort of what the outcome of a holistic interview process does for the school itself and through the rest of the pipeline as you go into practice. So Steve talked a little bit about how the admissions process has brought in a more diverse population. There's some good things and bad things about that. If you take the point from physicians training from the MCAT score, if you assume a 30 to 40 year time in practice, that physician at any point in time has to take somewhere between 8 and 12 standardized tests throughout the course of their career to maintain the current certification. At no point in time after the MCAT do we really care, and I'll talk a little bit about the one other time, which is USMLE Step 1. Do we actually care about what that number is in terms of how successful someone is? And again, we use the USMLE Step 1 as a gateway into the second phase of training, which is graduate medical education for physicians. And again, it's because residency programs are faced with 5,000 applicants for their 30 spots. And a quick and easy way to do this is to look at the standardized test score about sort of who should be in their specialty and who should not. But beyond that, we're not asking about the test. So I don't think there's an argument here about whether or not standardized tests are good, bad, and different. I think you all, just so you know, it was unanimous pretty much that people wanted a physician who had passed their licensing exam. And as someone who's going to leave here right at the end of my session to go write questions for the standardized board exam, I can tell you the real interest there is patient safety. But once we come up with that threshold, beyond that threshold and what that score is, I do think that there's something that's immaterial because we have said this is a competency-based exam. And what is the difference between the 20th percentile and the 99th percentile, especially when the patients who are on the other end have no idea what the score was in the first place. So there is this pipeline, and we have to have students in the system that can pass these 12 hoops that are going to come in front of them in a career. But then what are those support systems? So the future Dr. Williams talked a little bit about needing to have institutions that have these support systems in place to get the student who might have the 24 through, because I could actually screw up the person who had a 35 on the MCAT exam. They could actually not show up to class and they probably will do just fine. But what support systems do I have at the institutional level to deal with those that I know might struggle through those 12 hoops? And sometimes it's not a lot. It's a delay in the time on task. It's more self-confidence. So going back to this model of why people go into higher education, it's actually quite similar once you get to medical school. So what is the motivation? Have you learned the study skills now that you're confronted with 3 times, 10 times, 20 times the information that you once were confronted with? So that's something in the diversity office that we try to provide, and I think we need to do much more in terms of making sure that those support systems are there. Because if we're going to take in and be true to our holistic admissions process, we have to know that the students there might struggle along those hoops. And it's not fair to admit somebody who you know is not going to be able to make it through those hoops. The second thing I want to focus on is class. And one of the things when Dr. Nivet talked about 90% of the medical students come from 2% of the socioeconomic class population in this country, unfortunately, that's even true for our minority students. It's not quite 90%, somewhere about 60 or 70%, but it is real. And we really haven't done enough within medicine ourselves to really deal with the class discrepancies there. The socialization process of what it means to be through higher education, what it means to be a physician, how to act, what your patient expects on the other end. And this is a huge problem when we take care of patients, because my patients don't come from the top 90% of the socioeconomic status climb. In fact, they're lower, and so often there's a disconnect in terms of personality that helps to perpetuate some of these disparities. So something that I think we all need to focus on, and especially within medical schools, is the class issue. And it's the one issue that we don't even like to talk about in the room. I sat at an admissions committee meeting, and I get to be the person in the room who's kind of going, this person comes from a rural place, 5 people in their family, average income is $45,000. Maybe we should look a little carefully at the road traveled for this person. And I'll never forget one of the surgeons sort of standing up and going, I'm middle class. I said, oh, and I'm going, you make 3 times as much as I do as a primary care doctor. I don't even consider us in the same class. What do you mean you're middle class? And knowing that that's the hat that our faculty are sitting under, who are clearly, you guys get the same list that we do of faculty salaries, they're clearly in the top 2%. So we often have to deal with class, and we haven't quite figured out what to do with that. Finally, I think Dr. Yoon and Dr. Williams, again, sort of earlier today, talked a little bit about this pipeline, and Dr. Nivet also talked about this attraction model. So one of the issues that we deal with once you've gotten holistic admissions and you've admitted these students, these young adults, you have to have an environment where they feel comfortable, where they feel part of the community. And the issue is when we have a pipeline that's leaky, even within the medicine track. So 12% of the medical school class here at the University of Michigan represents the historically underrepresented minorities. When we get to the GME level, so the residents and fellows in our hospitals, that has dropped by half, that's 6 to 7%. When we get to the faculty here at the medical school, that's dropped again to another 5 to 6%. And guess what? I can actually brag about those numbers because they look good compared to the top tier medical schools. So what is it about a student who's coming to interview that we've let in through the holistic process, and now they're looking at the faculty who's going to teach them. They're looking at the environment around them. So we have to do a lot in the diversity office about building that community around them so that the house staff will stay, the faculty will stay, and that those folks also have a place where they can be part of a community and be part of and find a place where they feel comfortable as part of members of the academy. So this climate issue is important. One of the things I've been listening to, you talked a little bit about the Gates Scholars. There's the posse groups. So now sending, groups of kids from underrepresented or disadvantaged backgrounds to particular schools, so they have a posse, 8 to 10 of them, and they're finding that there's much more success. We actually could probably borrow that idea into medical school for faculty. In fact, here's your posse. Here are the people that you go to when there's an issue, and see if that actually promotes success along the line. So we're looking at how do you do that and how do you think about that institutionally. And then finally, the definition of diversity is really of issue here. And we spent a lot of time in Dr. Yoon's talk showing the demographics of the historically underrepresented in medicine. But if we really look at the definition of diversity, we really need to broaden that. We need to broaden our coalitions. The medical students are actually forcing us to do this. Our customer is often the students, and they're pushing us. So how do you involve lesbian, gay, and bisexual students in this conversation? Dr. Gay talked a little bit about, we've made a decision here in Michigan that Arab Americans is part of our underrepresented group, because that is part of the group that we represent in the patient population that we see here in Southeast Michigan that we need to be attuned to. But the issue is, what happens when you broaden your coalition of diversity, and what happens to those historically underrepresented within the academy, and how do they feel, and how do you assume that the programs and the support systems that you have in place for those don't get squashed or sidelined secondary to your broadening of the definition of diversity. And this is actually really interesting among the underrepresented minorities in medical school when we get to class. Because what we're finding, at least in the diversity office, is that if I need to mentor students around issues of socioeconomic status, that group is quite diverse. It's not all brown and black students. It's the students from the UP. It's the students from the rural areas. It's the students, recent immigrants in. And so how do you actually address this issue when you think about it? And so we're really thinking about how to give programs about the socialization process when all your colleagues are in the top 2% of the income and had experiences that you can't even think about. However, you might have a better idea about what your patient's feeling on the other side. And then finally, a little bit about this meeting that I'm going off to after this session. And so I heard, Percy, there's a couple of people about, when you sit on the, at what point in your life do you talk about, we don't need any admissions tests, you do need tests, which side of the line you're gonna stand on. And even there, we look and we talk about who's writing the test questions. So some of these questions that had been solved at the K through 12 level, looking at the SAT and the ACT about item writers, 20, 30 years ago, are new questions for us in medicine in terms of making sure, how do you write a multiple choice question that has to deal with cultural competency? How do you write a multiple choice question that will allow you to deal with communication nuances between a doctor and a patient? And how do you standardize that across thousands of patients? Those are things that we do struggle with in medicine because, as Dr. Nivet said, the end point is really the patient and really trying to deal with disparities. And the one final point that we're talking about here at the University of Michigan as a point of attraction is this issue of how do we deal with issues of health equity and eliminating health disparities. And once we've flipped the conversation to some extent to stop talking about diversity for diversity's sake and talk about diversity, as Marc puts it, a tool to deal with and improve health equity, now I can talk on an even playing field with my colleagues. Now I can really sort of figure out that this is really about the patient, and it's hard, the hardliners in the audience can't argue about the special preferences because we're really trying to the end goal to improve care. And what we have found that that's really the argument that we need to do. So thank you.
At Rackham Graduate School, we've had a number of changes over the last few years, namely because of policy restrictions and around diversity. And so these restrictions / limitations have also opened new opportunities. But I want to talk about some of the challenges that we have faced. And one of those is the perception or interpretation of that policy, right? And a lot of times, the way in which we decide to act, the way we practice, is kind of based out of this fear. You don't want it to be them, this lawsuit that you made this choice to implement a policy in the incorrect way. So in addition to that, at the graduate level, there's this pipeline issue. And one of the pipeline issues around diversity is where these students are coming from. What does this undergraduate pipeline look like? With diversity being attacked across the country systematically, what we've seen is that in states where there are high numbers of students of color, that's also our pipeline, right? California, Texas, Washington, Florida. And so as that pipeline is somewhat, in some ways, closing, it's also changing because the demographics within those states are changing so rapidly as well. One of the things that has come up and been talked about a lot is using these non-cognitive measures, and that they can be one of the debates is that they can be proxies for race. And in my opinion, and what I've seen is that they become false positives in that regard, and that in graduate education, when we start to look at some of these other non-cognitive factors, they may not always represent a diverse, as in racially diverse, community. But in addition to that, we have emerging populations. We have an undocumented population in this country that is starting to take steps into graduate education. This is another form of diversity that is a challenge and that is beginning to get addressed across the country. More than 50% of our applications this past year were international. That is huge. We are changing the way in which we educate, not just locally, but globally. So some of the opportunities that we get to evaluate the process. We get to look at how we look at students. We get to re-examine that process in the admissions committees, right? Which are very different than what we've been talking about all day. At the graduate level, we're in these small areas, right? Where there's a committee of maybe 3 or 4, where there are a lot less students in that pipeline. But as we look at comprehensive definitions of merit, it's important that we don't get them confused with how we've positioned merit and diversity as enemies of each other, right? That within that process, that dialogue is clear and concise, and that there are goals outlined in the way in which we look at leadership, the way we look at social, academic, and community engagement, the way we understand and review their life experiences. How do we incorporate the socioeconomic position of these students and what those experiences will add to the classroom, to their research, to the field. There's two things were mentioned this morning, one by the future Dr. Williams, where she's at, go higher ed. She talked about mechanisms for success. Another comment was made about when we talk about these students who may not be at the top level, we have to make a commitment to policy, right? We have to make a commitment to practice in which to support all students that we deem as meriting admission. So that comes to my area. That comes to the office that I oversee and the reinvention of graduate student success at Rackham Graduate School, which is a very unique opportunity to look at the way in which we construct our graduate students, not just in their experience as students here, but as they prepare to become faculty, administrators, community leaders. So there are 3 different areas that we have decided to focus on. The first is looking at interventions. How do we address needs of students without necessarily looking at them as support or students that need extra help, right? All through undergrad, it's like, oh, you're that student, right? You're the student that had this SAT and this GPA and came from that community. The interventions that we're taking on look at diversity and mentoring in a more holistic way. We've developed faculty allies for diversity, getting members within each of the departments to address diversity from within. We're not experts on how diversity is looked at in different areas, and it's important that the faculty also hold those values close to them. In addition to that, they've also become eligible for diversity grants, in which they've taken the initiative upon themselves to implement and develop new ways in which to attract and use the students that attract new students, but also use the students that they have and the resources that they have to make sure that students have a more inclusive experience. I'll talk about this again right at the end, is also the Rackham Merit Fellowship, which is in your binders. And it talks about the program, and that program is something that really had a lot of transition or transformation because of Prop 2 and also the post-Gratz and Grutter decisions. And the Rackham Merit Fellowship is one of the fellowships that are very unique in the whole country, in that you get a 5-year fellowship to come to Michigan, and you're fully funded. And that has really been an impetus for Rackham to produce in all the racially understood to be underrepresented communities as a top 10 producer of PhDs in each of those areas. So that program had to come under review. We had to really think about, this has been the pipeline for students of color into graduate school. How can we address some of the main issues that are at play in the selection process? Because without money, as we know, a lot of the students would not be able to choose graduate education. Now, I'm talking about a wide array of students, but in particular, students who come from lower income backgrounds. The second is pipeline, is recruitment, which really ties into that piece as well. And that is looking at partnerships that we've developed on campus, looking at partnerships that we've developed with HBCUs, with other minority serving institutions across the country. And this is where it becomes somewhat of a challenge, because we need to start thinking about how we partner with other states who have these restrictive pipelines. And so with these restrictive pipelines, how are we going into those states and talking to them about what we can offer and say, how are we projecting ourselves as different from the experience that they've already had, right? They're saying, well, diversity is not valued where I'm at, right? We don't have anything because affirmative action doesn't exist here. And they use affirmative action as a proxy for commitment to diversity. And it's a challenge for us to now translate our challenges here with same policy challenges in a way that's comprehensive and understood, so that we're not selling Michigan as in Michigan football. We're selling Michigan. Well, I was here last night with Al Borges, and he was saying, we got the best facilities and we got the best stadium. Well, we also have to talk about the best kind of graduate education we can offer and preparing them for the future. The last part is professional development. We really think that in preparing students in looking at diversity and meritocracy or merit is really about preparing them for the future. They need to be prepared to engage intellectually, academically, personally, and professionally within their field. And the reason why all those things are important is because we don't operate within silos. A lot of times people think you work on this project, you pass your exam, you write your dissertation, and you're done. But that's not the case. Life happens in graduate school. People have family issues, people get ill, people get married, people find partners, people have children. And there's all these conflicting types of situations that students need to be prepared with, and they need to find balance, they need to prepare themselves. We have less than 50% of our PhDs are going on to academic careers, right? So that's a huge transition from what they're being told they're going into a PhD program for, and what our faculty also prepare them for. So it's really important for us as a graduate school to give them skills, but then also as we communicate and work with faculty in their mentorship of their students about how to guide their students beyond an academic career. I think the last part is really just focusing on the fact that we've really tried to disconnect the battle between merit and diversity. I wrote in here 3 different ways, merit versus diversity, these dichotomous enemies, right, about access for students of color. Meritocracy versus fundamentalism, that we have to have some way to measure and separate those that are the best based on these objective measures from those that don't belong here. Because those that don't belong here have other jobs to do, right? We need somebody to do all the different jobs that we have, right? We all get our car fixed by somebody. We all, we all have someone, well, maybe I have a son that cuts my lawn. We have people in our society that have these other roles, and we base this whole notion of merit versus this fundamentalistic opportunity for these others that don't belong with us. And this other notion of merit versus talent, right? That merit is measured based on intellectual ability versus talent, and how do we measure talent? And those are things that I feel like Michigan has done a really good job of. When we look at, we're celebrating our centennial. We've had alumni panels, and when you look at the folks that have come in to the University of Michigan and graduated, they've taken many different paths, but they've been leaders because of, I feel like, the talent that we have been able to seek, find, nourish, and develop. So those are my comments, and I'm the one that did not choose med school.
So I really appreciated Mark's focus on us redefining excellence as opposed to really maintaining this focus on diversity. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the fact that we have affirmative action policies. Does that maintain this dichotomy between diversity and excellence? Are we better off not having that?
That's a great question. It's funny. There were 2 things when I took this job. There was 2 reasons why I thought it would be a good time to take this job. One was I thought we had that 25 years before I'd see a Fisher versus Texas case, and the other one was that healthcare reform had happened, and now that's in front of the Supreme Court. So clearly, if I ever tell you if I'm betting, don't follow my bets, because clearly I don't do it well. I don't risk adjust well. The affirmative, what's really interesting, I recall in your remarks, to answer the question this way, you talked about Justice Kennedy. One of the clear things to me that came out, I recently reread his judgment in his dissent in the Grutter case. One of the things he said is he wasn't against, the affirmative action and the critical mass argument. He was not believing that the university was doing critical mass correctly. He was saying that critical mass is basically a proxy for quotas. And then he actually points to some of those small liberal arts colleges. In his dissent, he says something like, if you look at, the Swarthmores or the Amherst, he says what you see is a different numbers of diversity every year. So it's not the way many of our institutions are, where there's 10% underrepresented minorities every year paying attention. So he thought that was a quota. So as I think about our opportunity, we're actually writing an amicus brief at AAMC. Our opportunity is to, that's going to be our only shot in this, speaking frankly, is to move Kennedy on this. And I think he's movable, and I think we have the argument to make around excellence. The rationale in medicine, to me, I'm biased obviously, is a much stronger rationale about outcomes. Everyone has process measures, proxy measures. We actually can show some outcomes. I'm part of a couple of studies that are looking at how diversity, that diversity of perspective, that diversity by race, ethnicity actually matters at the point of care. There's a lot of solid research that's out there, and now we're trying to get people to hurry up and write this stuff so we can get it into the case. So for me, the affirmative action in the way it is misconstrued, yes, runs counter to diversity and excellence, but that's not the way affirmative action really is. No one really, I think people just start believing the media and the pundits and the, Roger Clegg's of the world, like, affirmative action is something negative, or it's something less than, or it means we're taking unqualified people. Too many people have bought into that. That's nonsense. It kind of gets to your point earlier about it's about taking qualified people and paying attention to race. And so when I'm asked oftentimes, are you a fan of affirmative action, I have to be careful in how I state that, because I have to say, this is how I define affirmative action, which is what affirmative action is. It's allowing race to be one element among many in terms of admitting a class or in hiring or whatever it is. It is not a disconnect between quality, that I'm hiring someone of some diminished quality or unqualified or whatever the case is. But we all have now, not we, many people have this negative connotation. When I say the word diversity, immediately they think affirmative action, or they think negative, or they think something along those lines, or they think race, ethnicity, or they think LGBT. Diversity means nothing more than differences. And I think, we've allowed others to capture the language. Language is very important to me, and I think we've allowed others to capture the arguments, capture the high ground, capture the salience of affirmative action, and capture just the imagination of the populace. And is it too, can we put that genie back in the bottle? Probably not, but I do think we have some compelling new arguments to make, and I think the way the military had a strong argument in the Grutter case, the way the business community came through, I think there's an opportunity for us in medicine to make a new, stronger, compelling case for continuing affirmative action.
But I know medical education's been in the so-called minority business longer than just about any other part of education, and had a minority affairs unit and so forth for many years. But aside from Mark that we just heard from, what did you say today, any of the rest of you, that you couldn't have said, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago? I wonder if you could add to that.
What didn't I say today?
I think it actually does reflect a little bit to what Mark said, but it does once again also reflect to what our definition of diversity is and what we are trying to do with it. It may have been 20 or 30 years ago that it was seen that it was about opportunities that were not being given. In medicine now, it is much more about serving populations that have no one to serve them. So it is no longer about, it is less about giving the individual a chance when they didn't get a chance before, but it is much more about serving a clear need that is not being served appropriately, correctly, and well. So if we look at how the argument may have changed, it is once again going all the way back to serving the patient in the way in which they wish to be served, in the way they choose to be served, and in the way they need to be served. If we do not improve the opportunities to do that, people will feel disenfranchised by the people who care for them. And in medicine, we cannot allow that to occur.
I think the new conversation, and I think I alluded to this, is really going to be a conversation about class, which gets to also some of the things that Steve was saying, because once you've offered opportunity, you're actually looking at a different echelon of minorities who are still going into medical school. It's still those people from the 18 schools or 20 schools, and it's a replication almost of the old boys network to some extent. They just look different. And so we have to be very sensitive to that issue as well, because again, the patients aren't coming from that background. And that is a very politically difficult conversation to have, even in a room like this. Because people don't want to, this is America, we don't talk about class. We don't talk about income. We don't talk about wealth in a way that is meaningful and put it out there.
Can I just add one thing, because I think it's always important to put some data to offer some context and perspective. You know, one of the interesting things in medicine is the proportionality to applicant to matriculant is identical. So there's like 15% of the historically underrepresented minorities, African Americans, Puerto Rican mainland, Mexican American, Asian Pacific Islander, 15% Native American, 15% of them apply to medical school, 15% proportionality get into medicine. The same is for the low socioeconomic statuses. Like, I forget the number off the top of my head, but it's a very low number of sort of at the lower rung of socioeconomic status, and that same, it proportionally gets in. It says something about the kind of holistic approach, but what I don't know and what I can't say with confidence is if we were to really increase that, the proportion of applications, which is what we're all out to do, would it hold? I mean, I don't know. I don't have the evidence to back that up. But it does say something about the medical schools being in this business for a very long time of trying to find talent and seek talent. I mean, you know, Bakke was a medical school case, right? The first affirmative action test case was at UC Davis, so it was Bakke. So we've been in the place for a long time, but part of my, this is personal frustration less than professional frustration, is just, I've looked at the data for I've looked at it, I didn't look at it for 40 years, but I've looked at it, I didn't look at it over 40 years, but I've looked at 40 years of data, and it's, the marginal success that we've had in diversifying the schools overall still is confounding to me, given the numbers of underrepresented minorities in biology, for example. So there are more minorities than ever taking biology, and you should see the proportionality in that go to application. And it's not happening. And so people do interventions in that space. That's another conversation. We don't have real measures and metrics of what these interventions are doing anyway, but again, that's a sidebar. But my point is where there's a gap, there's a disconnect, and I don't see enough intelligence and energy focused in that serious, in a rigorous way, the way we do everything else in medicine. We take the scientific, rigorous approach to care, to our research, to our education. When it comes to the diversity effort, it's still, we tried, we're doing good, we lose the scientific rigor that sits at the medical school campus, and that confounds me, and I've been, that's part of what I'm trying to do, is to get people to say, there is a rigorous approach that can be brought to bear on this issue.